I was born in the year 1840, in the month of February, on a farm in the western part of New York State, not far from the town of Rochester. My father was at that time 30 years of age, having been born in 1810 in Connecticut. He had migrated to New York as a young man, seeking cheaper land and better prospects than his father's exhausted farm in Connecticut could provide. The land he purchased in New York was heavily forested, and he spent years clearing it, removing stumps, breaking the soil for cultivation. By the time I was born, he had established a productive farm of 160 acres, though the labor required to maintain it was unceasing. My father was a man of considerable strength and determination. He stood perhaps 5 feet and 10 inches in height, which was tall for men of that generation. He had dark hair and a full beard, broad shoulders, and hands made powerful by decades of physical labor. He could work from dawn until darkness without apparent fatigue. I recollect watching him fell trees when I was a small boy, swinging the axe with a rhythm and force that seemed almost mechanical in its consistency. He would work for hours without pause, and the trees would fall one after another until an entire section of forest had been cleared. He was also a man of learning, though his formal education had been limited. He had attended a common school in Connecticut for perhaps 4 years in total, but he had taught himself to read well and had accumulated perhaps 20 volumes over the years. He owned a Bible, naturally, but also Franklin's autobiography, several volumes of poetry, some agricultural texts, and a few works of history. He read by firelight in the evenings during winter, and he insisted that his children learn to read as well. He believed strongly that a man without learning was at a severe disadvantage in the world, regardless of how strong his back might be. We were 8 children in my father's household, though 3 died in infancy or early childhood. My eldest sister died of scarlet fever when she was 5 years old, before I was born. My younger brother died of diphtheria at age 3 when I was 7 years old. I recollect that death with particular clarity, the terrible struggle for breath, the white membrane in his throat, my mother's weeping, my father's grim silence as he built the small coffin with his own hands. Another brother died in infancy from what they called summer complaint. Of the 8 children my mother bore, 5 survived to adulthood. Myself, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters. My father rarely spoke of his own childhood or youth, but from fragments of conversation over the years, I came to understand that his early life had been marked by considerable hardship. His father, my grandfather, had been a farmer in Connecticut on land that had been cultivated for more than a century and was largely exhausted. The harvests were poor, and the family struggled to survive. My father left home at 16 years of age to seek employment in the city of Hartford, where he worked in a textile mill for several years. He saved what money he could from his wages, which were meager, and eventually accumulated enough to purchase land in western New York, where settlement was expanding and land was still relatively cheap. The migration from Connecticut to New York in 1828, when my father was 18 years old, was an arduous undertaking. He traveled primarily on foot, carrying his few possessions in a pack on his back. The journey took nearly 3 weeks. He walked along rough roads, slept in barns or in the open when no shelter was available, and survived on bread and whatever food charitable people would provide. When he reached the land he intended to purchase in western New York, it was entirely forested. virgin timber that had never been touched by an axe. He built a small cabin from logs he cut himself, living alone through that first winter with minimal supplies and no neighbors within miles. Over the next several years, he slowly cleared the land. It was brutal, solitary work. He would fell trees, remove the stumps by digging around them and burning them out, break up the soil for planting. The progress was agonizingly slow. In good conditions, he might clear an acre in several weeks. The forest seemed limitless, and his strength, though considerable, seemed insufficient to the task. But he persisted. Year after year, the cleared land expanded. By the time he was 25 years old and ready to marry, he had cleared perhaps 30 acres and had a functioning farm that could support a family. He married my mother in 1835 when he was 25 years old and she was 19. She was the daughter of a farmer in New York whose land adjoined my father's property. They courted for approximately 1 year before marrying. My mother was a woman of great capability and endurance. She maintained the household, bore and raised the children who survived, worked in the fields when necessary, preserved food, made clothing, and performed the countless other tasks that farm women of that era were expected to accomplish. She worked without complaint from before dawn until late in the evening, every day of her life, until she died in 1884, at the age of 68. I grew up performing farm labor from the earliest age I can remember. By the time I was 6 years old, I was tending livestock, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, carrying water, performing whatever tasks a small child could manage. As I grew older, the work became more demanding. At 10 years old, I was following a plow. At 12, I could swing an axe competently. At 15, I could perform nearly all the tasks required on a farm, though I lacked my father's strength and endurance. My father was not a harsh man, but he was stern and demanded diligence from his children. He believed that idleness was a form of moral failure. He would say that God had given us hands and strength for the purpose of labor, and that to waste these gifts was an offense against providence. He rarely praised us when we worked well, but he would reprimand us sharply if we shirked our duties or performed them carelessly. I recollect once, when I was perhaps 13 years old, I failed to properly secure a fence I had been mending, and several cattle escaped into a neighbor's field. My father did not beat me. He rarely resorted to physical punishment, but his words of disappointment were more painful than any blow would have been. He told me that careless work was worse than no work at all, because it created problems that others must then solve. I never forgot that lesson. Despite his sternness, my father was also capable of gentleness, though he displayed it rarely and awkwardly. I recollect him sitting by my bedside when I was perhaps 9 years old and gravely ill with fever. The doctor had been called and could offer little hope. My father sat in a chair beside the bed through the night, and when he thought I was unconscious, he spoke quietly, saying that he could not bear to lose another child, that I must fight to live. I recovered from that illness, and though my father never mentioned that night afterward, I never forgot hearing those words. The education I received was limited by the demands of farm labor. I attended the district school when planting and harvest did not require my presence, which gave me perhaps 4 years of regular schooling in total. I learned to read tolerably well, to write in a clear hand, and to perform mathematical calculations. My father supplemented this education by insisting I read from his books in the evenings. He would question me about what I had read to ensure I had comprehended it. Through this combination of formal schooling and my father's instruction, I acquired more education than many of my contemporaries, though far less than what is now considered minimal. When I was 20 years old in the spring of 1860, I began courting a young woman named Margaret Collins. She was 18 years old, the daughter of a farmer whose land was approximately 3 miles from my father's farm. We had known each other slightly since childhood, as our families attended the same church. She was small in stature, but possessed of considerable determination and capability. Her mother had died when Margaret was 14 years old, and she had assumed responsibility for much of the household labor for her father and 3 younger siblings. My father approved of Margaret, which was essential, as I would not have married without his consent. He said she came from good stock and appeared to be a sensible young woman who understood the realities of farm life. We were engaged in the autumn of 1860 and planned to marry in the spring of 1861, after I had completed building a house on the portion of land my father had agreed to deed to me. But these plans were interrupted by war. In April of 1861, the rebellion commenced with the attack on Fort Sumter. President Lincoln called for volunteers, and the entire nation descended into conflict. I was 21 years old. My younger brother James was 19. We both felt obligated to enlist. My father was 51 years old at that time, and while he could still perform farm labor competently, the prospect of losing 2 sons to war troubled him greatly. He needed our labor to maintain the farm, particularly as my other brother Thomas was only 15 years old and not yet capable of a man's full work. I recollect the evening I informed my father of my intention to enlist. We were in the barn, finishing the evening chores. I told him that I felt it was my duty to serve, that the Union must be preserved. He stood silently for some time, leaning on his pitchfork, looking at me with an expression I could not fully interpret. Finally, he said, "A man must do what his conscience requires. I will not prevent you. But you must understand that war is not the glorious adventure young men imagine it to be. Men die in war, often for no good reason. If you go, you may not return. You must reckon with that possibility before you make your decision." I told him I had reckoned with it and was prepared to accept the risk. He nodded slowly and said, "Then go with my blessing, but do not go seeking glory or adventure. Do your duty, keep your head down, and come home alive. That is all I ask." Those words remained with me throughout the war. James and I enlisted together in May of 1861, joining the New York Volunteers. We trained at a camp near Albany for several weeks before receiving orders to march south. Margaret and I married hastily before my departure in a simple ceremony at our church with only immediate family present. We had one night together as husband and wife before I left for war. She wept when I departed, though she tried to conceal it. My father shook my hand firmly and repeated his admonition, "Keep your head down and come home alive." The war lasted 4 years. I participated in numerous engagements: Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Cold Harbor, Petersburg. I was wounded twice, neither injury severe enough to remove me from service permanently. The first was a bullet that grazed my left arm at Antietam, leaving a scar I bear to this day. The second was shrapnel from an exploding shell that struck my right leg at Petersburg. The wound became infected, and I was hospitalized for 6 weeks, but I eventually recovered and returned to my regiment. My brother James was killed at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. He was shot through the chest during the disastrous assault on Mary's Heights and died within minutes. I was with him when he expired. He looked at me with confusion and fear in his eyes, tried to speak, but could not, and then was gone. He was 20 years old. We left his body on the field with hundreds of others. After the war concluded, I attempted to locate his grave, but was unsuccessful. He remains buried somewhere in Virginia, in a location I have never been able to identify with certainty. I wrote to my father informing him of James's death. His reply, which I still possess, was brief and formal. He wrote, "I have received your letter informing me of James's death. Your mother grieves terribly. I trust you will remember my admonition to keep your head down and return home alive. We have lost one son. I cannot endure losing two. Your father, Nathan Mitchell." The stark simplicity of that letter conveyed more emotion than any elaborate expression of grief would have done. I survived the war and was mustered out in June of 1865. I returned home to find my father visibly aged. He was 55 years old, but appeared considerably older. His hair had gone gray, his face was more deeply lined, his movements were slower. The loss of James had affected him profoundly, though he rarely spoke of it. My mother had aged even more dramatically. She had always been thin, but now she was almost skeletal. The grief had consumed her physically as well as emotionally. Margaret had waited for me and had been living with my parents during my absence, helping them maintain the household. When I arrived, she ran to me and held me while she wept. My father shook my hand and said simply, "You followed my advice. You came home alive." That was all he said about my return, but I saw tears in his eyes, which I had never witnessed before. I resumed work on the farm, and Margaret and I established our household in the small house I had built before the war. We had 7 children born over the course of 14 years. 2 died in infancy, 1 from croup, another from scarlet fever. 5 survived to adulthood. This was considered fortunate. Many families we knew lost half their children or more. Returning to farm work after 4 years of war was both a relief and a challenge. The rhythms of agricultural labor, the planting and harvest, the tending of livestock, the endless cycle of repairs and maintenance, provided structure and purpose after the chaos of military life. But I had changed during the war. I had seen things that could not be unseen, experienced things that could not be forgotten. Sometimes, while plowing, I would hear a sudden noise and drop to the ground instinctively, my body remembering danger even when my mind knew I was safe. My father noticed these reactions but said nothing. He simply waited for me to recover and continue working. Over time, the war's hold on me gradually loosened, though it never fully released. The nightmares became less frequent. The sudden terrors diminished. But I was not the same man who had left in 1861. My father understood this, I believe, though we never discussed it directly. He had not experienced war himself, but he had lost a son to it and had seen another son return, changed by it. He gave me time to readjust, assigned me tasks that kept me occupied, and made space for my silence when I could not speak. Working alongside my father in those years after the war, I came to appreciate aspects of his character that I had not fully understood in my youth. His consistency, his steadiness, his refusal to be overwhelmed by circumstance, these qualities, which I had sometimes found tedious or limiting when I was young, now seemed invaluable. The world might descend into chaos, nations might tear themselves apart, thousands might die in a single afternoon, but my father would still rise before dawn, still work his land, still fulfill his obligations. This was not mere stubbornness or inability to comprehend change. It was a philosophical stance, a belief that individual duty and daily labor mattered regardless of larger events. My father continued to work the farm actively until he was approximately 70 years old. Even then, he did not fully retire but continued to perform lighter tasks, mending equipment, tending the kitchen garden, overseeing work that my brother Thomas and I now performed. He was a man who could not remain idle. To cease working entirely would have been, in his mind, to cease living. My mother died in 1884 at the age of 68 from a fever that started as a simple cold but progressed to pneumonia. My father was 74 years old at the time of her death. They had been married 49 years. I had never seen him weep, but at her funeral, tears ran down his face throughout the service. After her burial, he became noticeably more withdrawn. He spoke less, ate less, seemed to take less interest in the world around him. But he continued working, continued maintaining his routines, continued living. The world changed dramatically during my father's lifetime. He was born in 1810, when Thomas Jefferson was president, when the nation had only recently achieved independence, when most people lived on farms and worked with their hands. By the time he was old, the nation had been transformed almost beyond recognition. Railroads crisscrossed the country, telegraph lines connected distant cities, factories produced goods that had previously been made by hand. Cities had grown enormous. The population had increased many times over. Electric lights, telephones, and countless other inventions had arrived. I recollect specific moments when these changes manifested in ways that affected my father directly. The railroad reached our county in 1853, when I was 13 years old and my father was 43. We traveled to the nearest station to witness the arrival of the first train. The noise and spectacle overwhelmed us. My father stood watching the locomotive with an expression I had never seen on his face before, a mixture of awe and unease. On the journey home, he said very little, but finally he remarked, "The world is shrinking. What took 3 weeks when I came here can now be done in 3 hours. I do not know whether this is good or bad, but it is certainly different." The telegraph arrived in our town in 1861, just as the war was beginning. My father watched them string the wires and install the equipment with considerable skepticism. He could not comprehend how words could travel instantly through a wire. When the telegraph operator demonstrated the technology, sending a message to a station 50 miles distant and receiving a reply within minutes, my father shook his head in bewilderment. "It seems like witchcraft," he said. "I understand that it is science, but it feels like magic." He never fully trusted the telegraph and preferred to send letters by post, even though they took days to arrive rather than minutes. Electric lighting arrived in our town in 1891, when my father was 81 years old. Several businesses installed it, and the main street was illuminated with electric lamps. My father and I walked through town one evening to observe this innovation. The brightness was remarkable, as clear as daylight, though it was well after sunset. My father admitted it was impressive, but said he could not imagine wanting such harsh illumination in his own home. "Firelight and lamplight are sufficient," he said. "This electric light shows every imperfection, every bit of dust, every wrinkle. Some things are better left in shadow." He lived the rest of his life by kerosene lamp and firelight, never permitting electric lighting to be installed in his house. The telephone came to our area in 1896. My brother Thomas had one installed in his house, and he demonstrated it for my father, making a call to a business in town. My father listened to Thomas speak to someone miles away and heard the voice coming from the receiver. He shook his head in amazement. "In my youth, if you wanted to speak to someone, you went to where they were, or you wrote them a letter and waited for a reply. Now you speak to someone 10 miles distant as easily as if they stood beside you. The world my grandchildren inherit will be unrecognizable compared to the world I was born into." I recollect discussing these changes with my father in his later years. He found them both marvelous and disturbing. He could scarcely comprehend how the nation he had been born into, largely rural, agricultural, sparsely populated, had become this industrial colossus. He would say that he had lived too long, that he no longer understood the world. Yet he also expressed satisfaction at having witnessed such tremendous progress. He believed the nation was stronger and more prosperous than it had been in his youth, even if he did not entirely approve of all the changes. The turn of the century affected my father considerably. When the year 1900 arrived, he was 90 years old, and he understood that he was one of the last people alive who had been born in the previous century. This seemed to weigh on him. He would say that he had become a relic, that his time had passed, that he belonged to an era that no longer existed. Yet he also felt a certain pride at having lived so long and witnessed so much. His health began to decline noticeably after the turn of the century. He had been remarkably vigorous for a man of his age, but now his strength began to fail. His eyesight deteriorated significantly. His hearing became poor. He developed pains in his joints that made movement difficult. He slept poorly and ate little. Yet his mind remained clear almost until the end. He could remember events from his youth with perfect clarity, and would tell stories of his early life in Connecticut, his migration to New York, the struggles of clearing the forest and establishing the farm. In the autumn of 1901, my father's condition worsened notably. He developed a persistent cough that would not improve. The doctor examined him and told us privately that his heart was failing and that he would not survive much longer. We should prepare ourselves, the doctor said, for what was coming. My father was bedridden for the final 3 weeks of his life. We moved him to the front room of the farmhouse, where he could look out the window and see the land he had worked for more than 60 years. My wife Margaret and my daughters took turns caring for him, keeping him comfortable, bringing him food he could not eat, water he barely sipped. I sat with him for long periods, and we spoke of many things: his early life, my childhood, the war, the children and grandchildren, the changes we had witnessed. During those final weeks, my father's mind remained remarkably clear despite his physical decline. He would lie in bed, gazing out the window at the fields and forests. and he would tell stories I had never heard before. He spoke of his first winter in New York, living alone in a crude cabin with snow piled 6 feet deep around him, surviving on salt pork and cornmeal, wondering whether he had made a terrible mistake in leaving Connecticut. He spoke of meeting my mother for the first time when she was 15 years old and he was 21, and how he had known immediately that he would marry her, though he had to wait 4 more years until he had sufficient resources to support a wife. He spoke also of regrets that contradicted his later claim to have none. He regretted not being kinder to his own father before the old man died. He regretted harsh words spoken to my mother during difficult times. He regretted not telling James before he left for war how much he loved him. But then he would catch himself and say these were minor failings, that overall he had done his best, that a man cannot expect perfection of himself. By the time he made his final statement about having no regrets, I believe he had resolved these small guilts in his mind and achieved a genuine peace with his life's accounting. One evening, perhaps 5 days before he died, he asked me to read to him from the Bible. I read from Ecclesiastes, which had always been his favorite book of Scripture. When I reached the passage about there being a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, he stopped me and said, "That is the truth of it. Everything has its season. My season is ending. That is not tragic. It is simply the natural order of things. I have had my time to plant and my time to harvest. Now it is time to rest." He closed his eyes and seemed content. One afternoon, perhaps a week before he died, he asked me to help him sit up so he could see out the window more clearly. It was late October, and the trees were brilliant with autumn color. The fields had been harvested, and the land lay ready for winter. He looked at the scene for some time without speaking. Then he said, "I cleared that land with my own hands, every tree, every stump, every stone. It was forest when I started, and I made it into farmland. That is my monument. That is what I leave behind. Not words or ideas or inventions, but land that feeds people. That is enough. That is sufficient." He paused for a time, breathing with difficulty. Then he continued, "A man's life is measured not by years, but by what he builds and who he raises. I cleared this land. I built this house and barn. I raised 5 children to adulthood, and they have raised children of their own. That is the sum of my life. I have no regrets. I did what needed doing. I worked hard. I kept my word. I provided for my family. That is all a man can do, and it is enough." These were not his final words precisely, but they were the last coherent thoughts he expressed to me. He lingered for another week, growing weaker each day, speaking less and less, until he spoke not at all. On a gray November morning in 1901, with myself and my brother Thomas present in the room, his breathing became irregular, and then it stopped. He was 91 years old. He had lived through the entire 19th century and just into the 20th. He had been born when the nation was young and sparsely settled, and he died when it had become a great industrial power. We buried him beside my mother in the cemetery on the hill. It was a simple funeral. Perhaps 40 people attended, family, neighbors, a few old friends who had survived from his generation. The minister spoke briefly about my father's long life and faithful service. We lowered the coffin into the ground, And my brother Thomas and I filled in the grave ourselves, just as my father had filled in graves for his own parents and for the children he had lost. I have thought often about my father's last words to me, his reflection that a man's life is measured by what he builds and who he raises, that he had cleared the land and raised his children, and that was enough. At the time, I found these words somewhat stark and simple. I had expected something more profound, more elaborate, perhaps some final wisdom that would illuminate all of existence. But as I have grown older myself, I am now 91 years old, the same age my father was when he died, I have come to understand the deep truth in his words. My father was not a man of great learning or sophistication. He did not write books or make inventions or participate in great events that history will remember. He cleared forest and made farmland. He raised children. He kept his word. He worked hard every day of his life. By the standards of great men, his accomplishments were modest. But by the standards of an ordinary human life, they were considerable. He took wild land and made it productive. He took helpless infants and raised them to be capable adults. He built structures that sheltered his family. He left the world in a better condition than he found it. What more can reasonably be asked of a man? I believe my father understood this truth in a way that I, with more education and broader experience of the world, had failed to fully grasp. He was not troubled by the fact that history would not remember him. He was not seeking glory or fame or even widespread respect. He wanted only to do his work well, to fulfill his obligations, to leave something behind that would endure after he was gone. The land he cleared continues to produce crops. The house and barn he built still stand. His children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren continue to live and work. That is his legacy, and it is not insignificant. I think also about what my father said regarding having no regrets, that he had done what needed doing. This seems to me a remarkable statement for a man to make at the end of 91 years. Most people, as they near death, are tormented by regrets. Things they should have done differently, opportunities they should have seized, words they should have spoken or left unspoken. But my father claimed to have no regrets. I have wondered whether this was truly accurate, or whether it was simply the declaration of a man determined to die without complaint. Having now reached the same age myself, I believe it was genuine. My father lived according to a simple code. He identified what needed to be done, and he did it to the best of his ability. He did not waste time contemplating alternatives or imagining different paths his life might have taken. He accepted the circumstances he found himself in and worked within them. This approach to life, while it may seem limited or unimaginative, has the advantage of eliminating most grounds for regret. If you do your duty as you understand it, work hard, and maintain your integrity, you can reach the end of life with a clear conscience. This is not to say that my father's life was easy or without sorrow. He buried 3 of his 8 children. He lost a son in war. He lived through periods of economic hardship and physical suffering. He worked brutally hard for more than 70 years with little rest or recreation. By modern standards, his life would be considered one of deprivation and excessive toil. But he did not view it that way. He accepted hardship as the natural condition of existence and found satisfaction in meeting his obligations and providing for his family. I have tried to live according to similar principles, though I cannot claim to have matched my father's consistency and determination. I cleared additional land, built a larger house, raised my children, worked the farm that my father established. I have also buried 2 of my 7 children and have grieved for them, as my father grieved for his. I have worked hard all my life, though perhaps not quite as hard as my father worked. I have tried to keep my word and fulfill my obligations. Whether I have succeeded as well as my father did, I cannot judge with certainty. The world my father was born into has vanished completely. The world I was born into has largely vanished as well. I was born when Andrew Jackson was president, when the nation was predominantly agricultural, when most people lived on farms and worked with their hands. That world is gone. We now live in an age of cities, factories, automobiles, aeroplanes, radio broadcasting, electric lights. The pace of change has been almost incomprehensible. My father witnessed tremendous change during his 91 years, but the rate of change has only accelerated since his death. Yet despite all these changes, the fundamental truths my father expressed in his last words remain valid. A man's life is still measured by what he builds and who he raises. The specifics may differ. Modern men might build different things, raise children in different circumstances, but the principle endures. We are defined by our work, our integrity, our relationships, our legacy. A man who works hard, keeps his word, raises his children well, and leaves the world better than he found it has lived a good life, regardless of whether history remembers his name. I am 91 years old now, the same age my father was when he died. I feel my own strength failing. The doctor has told me that my heart is weak, and I likely will not see another year. I find myself thinking often about my father's last words, about his claim to have no regrets, about his satisfaction with having cleared land and raised children. I wonder whether I will be able to make similar claims when my own end approaches. I believe I will. I have done my duty as I understood it. I have worked hard. I have raised children who have themselves become capable, productive adults. I have maintained the farm my father established and have passed it on to my sons, who will pass it to their sons in turn. 4 generations have now worked this land that my father cleared from forest. That continuity gives meaning to all the labor, all the suffering, all the years of unceasing work. The land endures. The family endures. That is what matters. When I think about what I will tell my own children and grandchildren in my final days, I believe I will tell them much the same things my father told me. Work hard. Keep your word. Build something that will last. Raise your children well. Do not seek glory or fame or ease, but seek to fulfill your obligations and leave the world better than you found it. These are simple principles, perhaps even simplistic by modern standards. But they have sustained our family for 4 generations, and I believe they will continue to sustain future generations. My father's last words were not poetic or profound by literary standards. They were the words of a farmer reflecting on a life of labor, but they contained a truth that I have spent 91 years learning to fully appreciate. A good life is not necessarily a comfortable life, or an exciting life, or a celebrated life. It is a life of purpose, integrity, and productive work. It is a life that builds something lasting and raises the next generation to carry on. I tell this story now because I want there to be some record of my father and his words. Nathan Mitchell was born in 1810 and died in 1901. He cleared forest land in New York and made it into productive farmland. He raised 5 children to adulthood. He worked hard every day of his 91 years. He kept his word. He had no regrets. He believed that clearing the land and raising his children was sufficient legacy, and he was right. Those simple accomplishments mattered more than any amount of fame or recognition could have mattered. He built something lasting, and 4 generations later, his descendants continued to benefit from his labor. Those are the words I needed to hear at the end of my father's life, and they are the words I will pass on to my own children and grandchildren. Work hard, build something lasting, raise your children well, keep your word. That is enough. That is sufficient. That is what defines a good life. My father understood this truth, and he lived it for 91 years. That is his legacy, and it is considerable.